In theory, interviewing people on your podcast is a great idea. It turns a monologue into a dialogue. It adds another voice and point of view. And yet, so many podcast interviews just plod along. They're dull and uninteresting. So, how do you make a podcast interview fascinating, insightful, and something people really want to listen to? That's the topic of this video: how to use interviews in my podcast, in our series, How to Start a Podcast. I'm Mike Carruthers from Perfect Your Podcast. For my radio shows and podcasts, I've interviewed over 8,000 people. I've gotten pretty good at getting people to tell me what I want. I know how to coax interesting information out of someone. And you can too. But let's start at where to find people to interview. Online search is a great place to start. You can search for publicity directories of people who are available to do interviews. Just search "need guests for my podcast" and see what comes up. You can search for individuals and topics. That's what Google does so well. Fortunately, I don't have to go hunting for interviews much. People find me because I'm on a lot of mailing lists from publicists and publishers, but occasionally I go searching, and my go-to search engine is Amazon. I look for authors, and here's why. Authors want to sell their book, and doing an interview with you allows them to promote their book, so they're more likely to say yes. They've also probably got a better handle on how to be interviewed, and that's important. And since they have a book, they probably have a website, which makes contacting them easier. Now, not everybody's going to grant an interview to you, especially if you're a new podcaster. That's okay. Ask someone else. There are plenty of people to interview on any topic. Interviewing people is a skill, and you'll get better at it with experience and develop your own style. But like anything else, it helps to start out by being prepared. When someone agrees to be interviewed, ask them to give you 5 or so topics or questions that they would like to discuss. They may already have talking points prepared, and that way you're both on the same page. Now, it doesn't mean you have to talk about exactly what he or she gave you to discuss, but it's a starting point for you. Don't try to wing it either. Have a good idea what you want to cover before you start the interview. And I think you'll be a much better interviewer if you remember the purpose of a podcast: to attract, engage, and grow an audience. You're the audience's advocate. You want to ask the questions the audience would ask if they could. Often, with authors as an example, they'll send you questions for you to ask like, "What inspired you to write this book?" or "Who do you think this book will appeal to?" or "Tell me about the book cover." Your audience doesn't care about that. Remember, they're waiting to hear what's in it for them. Get to what the audience wants to hear as quickly as you can. I think my best advice to do a good interview is to not think of it as an interview, but a conversation. When you speak with someone in your living room or at work, the conversation just flows. There aren't any awkward pauses. Things simply unfold in the conversation. When you interview someone, you want that same flow, so trust your own curiosity. One technique I discovered early on was close my eyes. Normally, when you're interviewing someone, you have a lot of visual distractions. You're watching your levels and looking at your notes. But close your eyes and get your head in the conversation, and you will be a better interviewer. Yes, you have your notes and what your next question will be, but listen to what the person's saying. You'll find that some of the best interviews will be the result of going off in a different direction you never planned on. But if you don't listen to what the person is saying, you miss those opportunities. If you close your eyes and block out distractions and trust your own curiosity, you'll be a better interviewer. 2 more quick points about interviewing people in your podcast. Plan to edit them. Inevitably, in every interview, there will be questions and answers that don't work, or they're misunderstood, or they add nothing to the discussion. Why leave them in? Plus, if you're talking to someone and they get interrupted on their end, the doorbell rings, the dog starts barking, stop the interview and cut that part out. A little of that is fine, but don't waste your listener's time. Sometimes a topic or guest just doesn't warrant the entire 20 minutes or half hour you've allotted. Maybe part of the interview is great, but some of it's boring. Well, just use the good part. Why subject your listeners to what you know is boring? And lastly, and the most important thing, is just because you do an interview doesn't mean you have to use it. I interview people almost every day for my radio show and podcast, and about 20% of those interviews never make it on. It can be for a variety of reasons, from a bad connection to somebody has such a thick accent I can't understand what they're saying. But for the most part, it's because the guest wasn't a good guest. They either were too technical or too promoty, or they just couldn't communicate very well. Like I said, I've interviewed over 8,000 people and I'm pretty good at it, but I can't make someone be a good guest who isn't one to start with. And if they aren't, I'm not going to use the interview, and neither should you. Listeners won't sit through boring interviews. They just won't, so don't ask them to. Follow what I've outlined here, have standards, and you will be a better interviewer. Look for more training in my series, How to Start a Podcast. I'm Mike Carruthers. Thanks for watching.